So my name's Roger Malina. I'm originally trained in physics and then in astrophysics. I did most of my scientific work in space astronomy. But I've also had a second career as the editor of the Leonardo publications for the last 30 years. And so I've been heavily involved in this community of practice of artists working with engineers and artists working with scientists. 2 years ago, I was offered a position at the University of Texas in Dallas. So I left my position as a research astronomer, and I'm now in a School of Art and Humanities. And I have a dual appointment with the Department of Physics. So I'm sort of a bridging person between the natural sciences and the arts and humanities as a faculty member. And so I'm building up an art and science research program. And as part of that, for the first time, I'm myself engaging in a collaboration with artists, and we're creating an art installation that will also be a test bed for testing some scientific tools. So I'm looking forward to moving from documenting the work of this community to actually being a member of the creative community. 30 years ago, a lot of the art and science discussion was focused on the emergence of computers as a symbolic processing system that could be used in art. And that was really a very driving sort of focus of the discussion, which meant that a lot of the art and science discussion was with computer scientists and those kinds of scientists. One of the things that's really changed now, as I look at what's happening, is the art science discussion has really broadened to many other areas, which has epistemological consequences. So, in the 1990s, the art and biology movement started beginning, which is now the biohacking area. In recent years, artists have been working with nanoscientists, which is really quite recent. A lot of this, I think, was sort of really identified by a colleague of ours, Steve Wilson, who passed away, unfortunately, who noticed, in fact, that artists were beginning to work in all these different areas of science. And I think that has consequences for the whole discussion. First, because not all the sciences are epistemologically the same, right? The observational sciences are different from the experimental sciences, the social sciences from the physical sciences, and so on. And so I think the problem has become very much more interesting today. So that's the first thing that's happened since 30 years ago. The second thing, and we were very surprised about this, we worked with about 200 people in writing this report, and we discovered that about 15% of them had one university degree in art and humanities and one university degree in science or engineering. I can remember my father in 1962 trying to find all the people that had these kind of hybrid trainings, and he found about 20 in the whole planet. I mean, it was quite difficult to find these people. And so I think the second thing that's happened is there are new intellectuals out there that actually are able to speak both within the arts culture and within the science culture. That means they can serve as translators in a different kind of way, but also as mediators, right? And so what's interesting in some of these art and science collaborations, you find these hybrid individuals that somehow are the go-between between the science methodologies, the science questions, and the art ones. And I suspect that that's a thing that's going to keep increasing. In the last 5 years, we've seen a number of PhD programs appear in art and science. The most recent one is in France, the Sacre PhD program, which is between art schools and science faculties. And it's a PhD in art and science. And this is really a new situation in our community. The third thing is a really banal thing, but I think we really underestimate what internet culture means in terms of very deep methodological questions. And the way I like to put that is 30 years ago, we all kind of thought of the tree of knowledge. And so the humanities were in one branch and the sciences were in a different branch. And to connect branches in a tree is quite difficult. Either you have to be a monkey and jump from one branch to the other, or you have to climb down the branch and then climb up the other one. So the tree of knowledge metaphor actually then results in institutional structures where in a country like France, the music schools and the art schools are not even inside the university, right? I mean, they're in different organizations. Today, and many people have noticed this, we're seeing the emergence of what it's called networked knowledge. And the people that analyze citations, the people that analyze the way websites are connected together, have been noticing that indeed you're beginning to see connections between disciplines that didn't used to happen. And so if you look at a very common thing, which is citation of articles to other articles, suddenly you can see scientists citing people in other disciplines that they wouldn't have before. And trivially, it also means that if an artist wants to collaborate with a scientist 30 years ago, you know, Lillian Lin, for instance, worked at the IBM labs. It was very difficult. I mean, she had to find someone at a cocktail party, meet a scientist. He had to let her into the lab, and so on. Now, the artist just sends you an email. And so suddenly, it's facilitating interdisciplinary cooperation in a way it's just natural to people. And so I think we're in the middle of that transformation. When you start thinking about networked knowledge instead of the tree of knowledge, then it will have institutional implications. You will organize human organizations differently if you have a networked knowledge concept versus a tree of knowledge concept. So, you know, that's three things that I think, if we were having this interview 30 years ago, would not really be on the agenda. About 5 years ago, I used to start saying that interdisciplinarity is not a discipline. You know, so indeed what's happening is when an artist works with an oceanographer, it's sort of a different community of practice than when an artist works with genetic engineers. And the oceanographer and the genetic engineer actually don't have all that in common with each other, except they both use the scientific method. And the genetic engineer is an experimental scientist, and the oceanographer is an observational scientist. So I think the whole art science terrain has become what you would call heterogeneous, with these different clusters now, whereas 30 years ago it was so dominated by the information technology and computer discussion that it was a much more, and that's what the new media movement came out of, and so on. So yes, and I think it's a challenge for the PhD programs in art and science, and I've been working on this with one of my PhD students, which is there a core curriculum? I mean, is there a basic core curriculum that you would need to teach students who want to do this, or is there a different curriculum in each one of these areas? And there are probably some commonalities, research methodologies. I think one of the common problems that all these disciplines have is how do you establish a successful collaboration? And that's very difficult. And to my knowledge, there are very few training programs in how an artist or a scientist should collaborate together. So yes, I agree with you. The landscape has become complexified, and unlike many other interdisciplinary areas, it will not become a discipline. So when biology and physics started working together, it became biophysics, and there are now departments of biophysics. And so I think we have to be very careful that as these developments happen, we don't create institutional structures that lock in a landscape that is changing quite quickly. And I think that's one of the things that happened in the new media movement is institutions kind of froze a moment in time and set up new media programs, and now that's not where the focus of the discussion is. one of the discussions that we've been having at the University of Texas in Dallas is with a researcher called Paul Fishwick, who just arrived at the university. And he's a computer scientist, but teaching in a school of art and humanities, as I am. And he's been asking, a very straightforward question, which is, should humanities students know how to code? And our answer is yes. That if you're going to be an art and humanities student, you should indeed understand the ontologies of coding, the processes involved in coding, because that system has such deep consequences on how you organize information, how you analyze information. And so, it's not only a software studies question, but it's also a basic training question of what students in arts and humanities should know how to do. Now, 30 years ago, you probably remember the big discussion was, should artists know how to program? And that's when the first Photoshops and these kind of programs came out. And there were all kinds of artists that were users of tools and couldn't develop the tools. I think that question has become a much deeper question now, because internet culture and digital culture is so driven by the concept of coding that we need to have the facility with it. I don't know how you can do software studies without knowing how to code. So last semester, my graduate seminar that I was teaching was on experimental publishing and knowledge curation. And there, like you, I have a sense that the way that professionals document their work is evolving very quickly. And so the traditional scholarly literature is now surrounded by what's called the gray literature, which is very important documentation from professionals, but which isn't in the traditional scholarly literature. And of course, what we're seeing is new forms of annotated writing appearing, right? And so the blogging culture aggregates material in a very different kind of way than the traditional article, which freezes a text in time and so on. And so I think we are in a quite a rapid evolution of not only how scientists document their work, but how artists document their work. And so, I think one of the things that Leonardo has been having trouble doing is adapting with that community. So, the Leonardo publications very quickly started using the internet. We used desktop publishing. We were very early in desktop publishing. We started zines very quickly. We now have galleries on Flickr and Facebook and the social media. But I don't think yet there's new sort of established ways of documenting professional work that have stabilized. There are a few platforms out there that are beginning to appear, because traditionally what happens is, for instance, many journals now, they'll have a text and then they'll have multimedia add-ons. So it's not an integrated scholarly object, right? It's really a text plus add-ons, rather than really an integrated multimedia document which makes use of the visual material when it's more appropriate, the sound or the voiceover or the text, in a way that indeed readers then can annotate the text so that it evolves as the community of readers use that text. So, we're trying to do some of these things in the Leonardo publications, and the problem is nobody really knows yet what 20 years from now, how exactly we will be documenting work. Well, and what's interesting is all 45 years of the publication are now available online. Our readership has been going up very rapidly. And I think last year we had 400,000 individual articles downloaded. I mean, that is a lot of readers, right? 30 years from now, we were printing 2,000 copies of the journal, and they were maybe in libraries, and so several readers read the same copy. And so what's interesting, and of course all publications are finding this, is the older literature is getting used a lot more than when it was in print form. And so that's also shifting a lot of these practices. In this NSF study, we actually have a couple of white papers that look at the issue of intellectual property in art science collaborations. Some of these case studies, in fact, showed that the collaborations collapsed because the collaborators could not agree on how to handle intellectual property that came out of the collaboration. And there are very different cultures. If you're an artist in residence in a company in Silicon Valley, that's one thing. If you're an artist in residence in a research lab in an Institute of Advanced Studies, it's a different thing. Intellectual property is handled, and it's compounded by the problem that intellectual property itself, with the open source movement and so on, is evolving also. At the same time, I think we all have an interest, and I guess the analogy I would make is, as you know, in medicine in the last 10 years, governments have been setting up centers for translational medicine so that medical research findings are transferred into the use by doctors as quickly as possible. Well, we need translational art science practice also, so that when these collaborations come up with innovations or things that can be used in other applications, they're translated into societal use as quickly as possible and as smoothly as possible. Now, sometimes that translation is to the nonprofit sector, sometimes it's to the for-profit sector, and in general, in the universities I've been, the incubator system has difficulty handling these kind of art science projects. I think it's desirable to find ways to get what comes out of art science practice into societal use. So I think we should find these mechanisms. I'm certainly not an expert in that area, but it's certainly an area of lively debate. It also comes into the whole issue of how you set up a collaboration so that these things are clear at the beginning. Because often what happens is you get 3/4 of the way into the collaboration, and then that's when something breaks apart. And so I think in the business world, this is called strategic alliance training. So when two companies collaborate, actually they have methodologies for what happens to the shared intellectual property between the two companies, right? And so when two big companies collaborate together, there are business strategies. I suspect that we need forms of that in the art and science collaboration world. One of the things I've been involved in Marseille is setting up an Institute for Advanced Study, and it's had an art science residency program. What's unusual about that program is that it accepts artists as residents who want to work with scientists, but it also accepts scientists as residents who want to work with artists, which is much less common. We had I think a very nice example of a collaboration between a physicist who actually studies the physics of cities. So he models urban mobility, pedestrian, public transport, automobiles, and so on. And he works with a video artist. And what they did was, in Marseille, they'd been studying, I think, Venice and Rome, and they wanted to study Marseille. And actually, the two of them went around the city selecting together the places that would be studied. And that was sort of interesting, because obviously the video artist has very different considerations than the physicist of which places in the city to study. And so that was interesting to see the mutual influence that can happen in such a collaboration. And then, interestingly enough, as the video artist was working, she noticed things that the physicists didn't notice. And so I think it was unusual because often in these art-science collaborations, they're not very symmetric. The scientist influences the artist, but the artist doesn't influence the scientist. And so this was and I think these kinds of collaborations are difficult, which have this kind of asymmetry. A second example I'll give of a resident in this Institute for Advanced Study is a young Chilean artist, Xaviera Tejerina, and she was working with a hydrodynamics expert who studies turbulence in water. And so they were actually doing experiments together. There's a tank that creates waves and so on. And in the process of doing this work, they actually discovered a kind of wave that nobody had ever noticed before. And so she was actually in the scientific art-science collaboration, and a discovery was made. And that's kind of a really unusual situation. Now, it's not going to be a Nobel Prize, I don't think. The hydrodynamics scientist is still trying to explain this wave. He cannot explain it at the moment. And he certainly credits his work with the artist at focusing his attention on something where suddenly he made a discovery. And so I think in the art science arena, there are a number of these examples out there now which are beginning to appear. And that's one of the big debates in the art science community, which is the science of benefit to the art, or is the art also of benefit to the science? And that's hotly debated, and many scientists will say no. It's a one-way street. We influence the artist. The artist doesn't really influence us. Anyway, so these two examples are not earth-shaking, but I find them intriguing because they give a hint of maybe of what might happen in the future.